She is delusional. She is a parasite. She has no husband, no stable income, and she floats from city to city like a piece of driftwood with a college degree stapled to it. My stepfather, Gerald Whitmore, was not a man who whispered when he could shout. He stood at the plaintiff's table with his Italian suit and his $800 haircut, and he performed for the courtroom like he was auditioning for something. Look at her, Your Honor. He swept a manicured hand in my direction. She sits there like a statue. That right there is what mental incompetence looks like. She cannot manage a checkbook, let alone a trust. I am requesting full fiduciary guardianship over the Marlowe estate assets before she drains every last dollar. I sat with my hands folded on the table. I did not look at him. I looked at the courtroom's single window, a tall, frosted rectangle letting in pale winter light, and I thought about the first rule my mother ever taught me before the cancer took her. Never let a man who underestimates you know that he's wrong. Not yet. My name is Saoirse Marlowe. I am 31 years old, and the man trying to have me declared legally incompetent had been living in a house I secretly owned for the past 14 months. Judge Patricia O'Say leaned back in her chair, studying Gerald with the quiet intensity of someone reading a document she'd already memorized. She had said very little since the hearing began. That was the thing about Judge O'Say, that Gerald's legal team had clearly failed to research. She didn't interrupt weak arguments. She let them collapse under their own weight. Gerald was still going. She lives in a studio apartment. She drives a car with expired tags. Her so-called consulting business has no registered address, no employees, and no verifiable income. This is not a functioning adult. Your Honor, says a woman in crisis who needs a guardian before she liquidates her late mother's trust fund and disappears. He paused, straightening his cuffs. He looked satisfied, like a man who had just delivered a verdict rather than received one. Across from me, Gerald's attorney, a soft-featured man named Douglas Price, was staring at a document that had been passed to him 60 seconds ago. He had not blinked in 40 of those 60 seconds. His cheeks had gone the color of old chalk. I checked the time on my watch. 10:07 a.m., right on schedule. Let me tell you what Gerald Whitmore knew about me. He knew I had moved 6 times in 4 years. He knew I drove a 2019 Civic with a cracked side mirror. He knew I wore the same 3 blazers in rotation and ordered the cheapest thing on every menu when we had obligatory family dinners. He knew I had turned down a corner office at a Boston investment firm when I was 26, which he described, at my mother's funeral, as a tremendous waste of a perfectly acceptable education. Here is what Gerald Whitmore did not know about me. He did not know that I left the Boston firm because I had already started building something of my own. He did not know that something was Meridian Trace Consulting, a financial forensics firm specializing in asset recovery and fraud investigation for federal agencies, insurance carriers, and private clients with very large and very complicated problems. He did not know that the expired tags on my Civic were an administrative oversight I kept meaning to fix and genuinely kept forgetting, because I was usually in 3 cities in 1 week, and parking tickets were not my primary concern. He did not know that the studio apartment he pitied me for was one of 11 units in a building I purchased through a holding company 2 years ago. He did not know that the no verifiable income he was describing to a federal judge represented a business that had cleared $4.2 million in the previous fiscal year. And he absolutely did not know that the holding company Trace Asset Group was also the silent majority stakeholder in Whitmore Capital Management, his own firm, the one he'd inherited from my mother's estate and then slowly driven into the ground while blaming market conditions and everyone except himself. I need to tell you how this started. Not the court date, the moment I realized what kind of man Gerald actually was. My mother, Diane Marlowe Whitmore, died of pancreatic cancer 18 months ago. She was brilliant and funny, and she smelled like cedar and old books. And she was, without question, the worst judge of romantic character I have ever known. She married Gerald 7 years ago. I was 24. I came home for the wedding, smiled through every photograph, and then flew back to Boston and quietly ran a background check on him using tools I was not technically supposed to have access to yet. What I found was not criminal. It was just sad. Gerald Whitmore was a man who had spent 30 years being almost good at things. Almost good at finance. Almost good at managing other people's money. A career defined by proximity to success without ever actually achieving it, propped up by the reputations of better people, sustained by charm, and protected by the kind of confident mediocrity that certain men mistake for genius. My mother loved him. So I said nothing. When she got sick, Gerald became very attentive, very present. He held her hand and brought her soup and reorganized her financial accounts to simplify the estate process. He convinced her to restructure her trust. He brought in his own attorney for the paperwork. She trusted him. She signed. 3 weeks after the funeral, I got a letter from a law firm I'd never heard of informing me that the Marlowe family trust had been amended to name Gerald as primary fiduciary. My inheritance cash holdings my mother had built over 30 years was now under his management pending a competency review of me. A competency review. He had inserted that clause himself. Quietly. Without telling me. Without telling my mother's actual attorney. He planned to have me assessed, fail me on paperwork, and walk away with enough money to save his struggling firm and finance the lifestyle he felt he deserved. I read that letter sitting in a parking garage in Denver. I read it twice. Then I opened my laptop and I got to work. The first thing I did was pull every financial record attached to Whitmore Capital Management for the last 4 years. Gerald was not a fraudster in the dramatic sense. He was something almost more infuriating, a man who genuinely believed that mismanaging other people's assets was simply the cost of doing business. He had been quietly bleeding client accounts through excessive fee structures, undisclosed conflicts of interest, and a pattern of self-dealing so brazen it would have made a compliance officer physically ill. He was also, as of 8 months before my mother's death, functionally insolvent. His firm had 17 active clients. 14 of them were underwater. He was servicing those losses with cash from 3 newer accounts, which is the kind of financial structure that has a specific legal name, and that name is fraud. He needed my mother's trust money to fill a hole he had been digging for years. He needed me, declared incompetent, so he could take it without a fight. I needed him to keep thinking he was winning. So I made a phone call to a firm I had a relationship with, a distressed debt buyer who specialized in exactly this kind of situation. Through Trace Asset Group, I arranged for them to purchase Gerald's firm's outstanding loan obligations from 3 separate lenders. Gerald's bank was delighted to offload a client whose accounts looked like crime scenes. Then I waited. Gerald filed the competency petition 4 months later, right on schedule, his confidence completely intact. He had no idea that the majority interest in his own firm's restructured debt was now held by a company whose sole beneficial owner was the woman he was trying to have declared legally incompetent. Back in the courtroom, Douglas Price was now physically leaning away from Gerald, the document still clutched in both hands. Gerald was making a new argument about my personal life. He did this when he felt he was on stable ground, attacking the human instead of the facts. She has no significant relationships, no community ties. She has actively isolated herself from family, which, Your Honor, is a documented behavioral indicator of cognitive and emotional deterioration. He pressed his fingertips together. I am not her enemy. I am the only person in her life trying to get her real help. I let him finish. Then I looked at the ceiling for 3 seconds. I thought about Christmas 2 years ago, the last Christmas my mother was well enough to sit at a full table. Gerald had spent most of dinner on his phone. When I mentioned that I'd just renewed a federal contract, he had glanced up, smiled with exactly half his face, and said, "That's sweet, Saoirse. A government hobby, very stable for someone like you." My mother had squeezed my hand under the table. She knew. She always knew. I think that is what I was really doing in that courtroom. Not fighting Gerald. Finishing something she had started. Protecting what she'd spent 30 years building from a man who saw it as a rescue fund for his own failures. Judge Osei set down her reading glasses. "Mr. Whitmore," she said. "I'm going to pause you there." Gerald paused, magnanimously. "I have reviewed the financial summary submitted by the Respondents' Council." She held up a document. I recognized the Trace Asset Group ownership disclosure, and I want to make sure I understand the situation correctly before we proceed. She looked at him the way a person looks at a math problem that has already been solved. "You testified that Miss Marlowe has no verifiable income and no functioning business. Is that still your position?" "Absolutely," Gerald said, without hesitation. "Whatever she submitted is fabricated. She's very creative, Your Honor. It's part of the condition." Douglas Price put his face in his hand. "Mr. Price," the judge said. "Do you have anything to add?" Douglas looked up. He had the expression of a man who had just realized he was standing on train tracks. "Your Honor," he said carefully, "I would like to request a brief recess to consult with my client." "I'll bet you would," the judge said pleasantly. "But no. Continue." She turned back to Gerald. "Mr. Whitmore, are you familiar with a company called Trace Asset Group?" Gerald's composure flickered. "Just once. Just for a half second. They're a holding company," he said. "They purchased some of our firm's debt obligations. Standard restructuring. We worked with them last year." "You did," the judge agreed. She slid a document across the bench. "And who is the beneficial owner of Trace Asset Group?" Gerald looked at the paper. His jaw moved without producing sound. "That can't be right," he finally said. "That is not possible. I would have known." "I would have." "You would have known," the judge repeated, "if you had read the incorporation documents before signing the restructuring agreement." She folded her hands. "According to this, the sole beneficial owner of Trace Asset Group, and therefore the majority debt holder of Whitmore Capital Management, is Saoirse Marlowe." I had thought about this moment many times. I had imagined Gerald going pale, going quiet, going apologetic. What actually happened was that he laughed. It was a short, hard sound, the laugh of a man whose brain has briefly disconnected from reality as a defense mechanism. "She set me up," he said, looking at the judge with sudden, furious clarity. "This is a coordinated attack. This is exactly what I've been telling you. She is not mentally incompetent. She is dangerous. She has been systematically targeting my firm for reasons of personal vendetta, and I am the victim here, Your Honor. I am the one who needs protection." He turned to look at me for the first time since the hearing started. "How long?" he said. "How long have you been planning this?" I looked at him directly. "Since the parking garage in Denver," I said. 18 months ago. When I read your attorney's letter, you had no right. I had every right." My voice did not shake. I had rehearsed this part, but I had also lived it, which is a different kind of preparation. "You forged a competency clause into my mother's trust documents. You used her final months to restructure her estate in your favor. You hired a legal team to have her daughter declared mentally unfit, so you could liquidate 30 years of her savings." I picked up the loan file in front of me. "I did not attack you, Gerald. I became your creditor. There is a difference." Douglas Price had gathered his papers with the body language of someone defusing a bomb in slow motion. Gerald was still standing. "This proves nothing," he said, but his voice had dropped to something smaller. "You can't call the loan. There is a 12-month notice period. I know the terms. There is a 12-month notice period for standard default," I said. Paragraph 9. Section D. Outlines accelerated default conditions. One of them is initiating legal proceedings against a trace asset group officer or beneficial owner. I picked up a yellow-flagged page. "You filed the competency petition on November 14th. That was the trigger. The loan became immediately callable that same day." Gerald looked at Douglas. Douglas did not look back. "I'm not familiar with that clause," Gerald said, his voice very quiet now. "I know," I said. "You didn't read the agreement. You saw the 6-figure deposit and you signed." Silence. Not the tense, pressurized silence from the beginning of the hearing. This was a different kind. The silence that happens after a structure collapses when the dust is still settling and everyone is doing an inventory of what is left standing. Judge Osei brought her gavel down. "The petition for conservatorship is dismissed with prejudice." She looked at Gerald. "Mr. Whitmore, you will receive a formal notice of loan acceleration from Trace Asset Group within 24 hours. Given the documented pattern of self-dealing in your firm's client accounts, I am also referring the complete financial record to the SEC's Office of Compliance Inspections for review. This hearing is closed." Gerald didn't say anything when he left. He walked out of the courtroom without looking at me, without looking at Douglas, without looking at anyone. The door swung shut behind him and I sat in the sudden stillness and breathed. I did not feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that. I felt the way you feel when you've been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and you finally set it down. Not joy. Exactly. More like the memory of what standing upright without weight feels like. Outside, it was a gray January afternoon. The kind where the light looks like it never fully decided to arrive. I stood on the courthouse steps and called my operations manager to begin the formal notice process. Then I got in my Civic with the cracked side mirror and I drove to the cemetery. I sat with my mother for a while. I didn't say much. I told her about the hearing and the judge's face when Gerald realized, and I told her she would have appreciated the parking garage detail. I did not cry. I had done my crying already. In private. In hotels in cities that didn't know my name. In the 18 months between her death and this morning. I had a firm to run and 3 active federal contracts and a building full of tenants who needed a working elevator by Thursday. But I sat with her a little longer. Because some things you do not rush. And some lessons take a generation to finish teaching. The Marlowe estate was intact. Her 30 years of careful, quiet building were safe. And Saoirse Marlowe, the drifter, the woman with expired tags and a cracked mirror and cheap blazers, walked back to her car in the gray January light and went back to work.